Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. In case you don't know me, my name is Mara Grossman. I'm the president of the New River Valley chapter of Master Naturalists. So welcome, everyone. I'm very glad to see some familiar faces, or at least, eyes. It's been a long time since we've been able to meet in person, and also welcome to everyone who's joining us from the Zoom. I'm very glad that we're able to present it in both ways and all get together virtually and in person. So it's been a long time. It's been a long, I don't know, year and a half. And I'm just very grateful that everybody's been able to stay engaged in their own way. There's been a lot of good work being done, a lot of volunteer work. I'm very excited we'll be hearing more about our next class that's going to be coming up. So very excited that education component is going to continue. And with that, just going to go ahead and give you to Barb Glazier. Barb is in charge of organizing these things and has done a fabulous job, and will be introducing our speaker for the evening. So welcome, and here's Barb.
Okay, well, I thank you for the help. Barb. Oh, sorry. Oh, that's right. That's right. Thank you for all of you with your help with technology, because I kind of went into a panic mode about a week ago when I thought about all these things that had to happen to make this come off tonight. So thank you. Everybody was nice to me about it too. So I want to introduce Gary Cote. He's a familiar face in this area to us. He's retired from Radford University, where he taught cell biology and mycology. He grew up in New England and majored in biology at MIT. While earning his PhD at the University of California in San Diego, he met David, who he gives credit to making botanizing his hobby. For decades, he and David have made a study of the plants at Wildwood Park. And if you're a member of our local New River Valley, Virginia Native Plant Society, then you've been lucky enough to get emails from him and David as they've gone out and identified and let us know what was really a good thing to look for seasonally. His interest in tiny things brought him to his fascination about lichens. And he's given his presentations about mushrooms. Did you bring that in? That big old thing, that big old mushroom?
No, that was
Jay, oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay. I thought you were going to saute it up for us. But he's given his presentations on mushrooms and lichens to the New River Valley Native Plant Society, the John Clayton one, which I'm not sure where that one is.
That's in Williamsburg.
Okay. John Clayton is the name of a yellow blooming honeysuckle. That's because it was named after John Clayton. And also the Radford Outdoor Classroom. You've done a lot of work with them. So please welcome Dr. Gary Cote.
Barb, I thank you all for inviting me here to tell you about my very favorite kinds of fungi, which are the lichens. And you probably learned that fungi, the mushrooms you see in the wild and the woods, are not the really fungus. That's just the reproductive body, the fruiting body that produces spores. The everyday body of a fungus is just strands of hyphae that grow through the soil, the rotting log, the dying tree, or whatever. And that's because fungi cannot make their own food like plants do. They have to eat, but they can't move. So they can't go looking for food. All they can do is grow towards nutrients and then take up food that way. But lichens have turned the whole scheme upside down. Instead of growing outward, the hyphae grow inward around a group of algae or cyanobacteria that produce food for the lichen. And so as they grow inward, they create a structure, a definite body that we call the thallus of the lichen. In the lichen community, the working together of the algae or cyanobacteria and the fungus, the green alga or cyanobacteria is photosynthetic, so it can make its own food. And the fungus produces a chemical that causes the algae to leak. So they leak food out, and that feeds the fungus. The fungus, in return, provides a favorable microenvironment for the alga, keeps the humidity up, protects it from too much sunlight, and it can also absorb water and minerals and bring these into the algae to supply them. Now, there are thousands of species of fungi that are what we call lichenized. They live as lichens. And no one has ever yet found one of them living alone. They have to live with algae and a lichen symbiosis. The algae, on the other hand, there are only a handful of genera of algae or cyanobacteria that live in lichens. Some of them have only been found in lichens, but others have been found growing in the wild by themselves. So they're more facultative. They don't have to be in a lichen. But the fungus always does. It has to be a lichen or it cannot survive. Now, if I got you intrigued, you might find lichens where you look for them. And anywhere that they can get sunlight and moisture, obviously, but there are two things that are necessary for them. So many of them will grow on tree bark. And here, while some lichens will grow just about anywhere, the ones that grow on tree bark mostly specialize for tree bark. And some of them specialize for conifers. They grow only on conifers. Others grow only on hardwoods. But the peculiarity of the chemistry of tree bark is that birches are apparently conifers from the lichens' point of view. So lichens that grow on conifers grow on birches. And lichens that grow on hardwoods grow on Atlantic white cedars. I don't know why, but something about the chemistry. Other place you can find them is on bare wood. Many of the ones that grow on bare wood also grow on tree bark, but others specialize in bare wood. And some of them like to grow on dry wood. Some of them grow on rotting wood. And some of them grow on damp, very wet, rotting wood, like the Ruffle, the provocatively named fairy bark, common name, that grows on rotting wood around bogs and lake shores and places like that. Other lichens grow on rocks. And here they specialize again. Some will grow on basic rocks, high pH rock, like limestone. And the limestone jigsaw is an example. Others grow on what I like the name acid rock, but these are granite, for example. And in Wildwood Park is a limestone area. It's very basic. So you can find limestone jigsaw all over the place in the park. But they brought in a few granite boulders for one of them holds a plaque of dedication to the classroom. So on those granite boulders, you can find lichens that grow on acid rock, like the golden moonglow. They also grow on artificial rocks that people create, like mortar and cement, and they grow on human rock artifacts, like gravestones. So one of the best places to find lichens is in cemeteries. Old cemeteries have a wonderful collection of lichens. And then there are lichens that like to grow on the soil, usually poor soil, because if it's good soil, plants grow up and shade them out. So they usually grow where the soil is not good. The pink earth there, although photographed in Suffield, Connecticut, I've seen it in Montgomery County. So it's all over the place. And then there are lichens that will grow just about anywhere. So you can find them in places you would not expect lichens, like cars that don't move very much or neighborhood watch signs. Now, all the beginning biology books that I've seen will tell you what a lichen is, define it, and then they say there are three forms: crustos, crust-like; foliose, which is leaf-like; and fruticose, which is like the fruiting body of, well, in this case, of a coral fungus. Crustos is defined as so intertwined with the substrate that you can't remove it without just damaging either the lichen or the substrate. So they're grown into each other. Well, the lichen's grown into the substrate. They can be cryptic. And that means that they're growing inside the bark, or inside the rock. And only the fruiting bodies, in this case, the little black dots, on the outside. Or they a little bit more complicated, they can grow a skin over the top, an upper cortex, we call it, of tough hyphae. But the underside is still growing down into the rock or into the bark or whatever it's growing on. And so they're still inseparable. Now, the next stage up, take one of these and give it a lower cortex. And then you've got a foliose lichen. It's also called a stratified foliose because it has layers, strata. There's an upper cortex. There's a lower cortex. There's some loose hyphae in the middle called the medulla. And then there's a layer of algae at the top where they get as much sunlight as possible. And the upper and lower cortexes are going to be different. They're different colors, and they have different structures on them. For example, the lower cortex has often, well, in most foliose lichens, not all of them, but most of them, there are rhizomes. Rhizome comes from the Greek word for root, but they're not roots. They cannot carry water. They can't carry nutrients. All they really are hold fast. They hold the lichen down. They're useful for identifying the lichen because they can be different colors, like black, or in this case, black with white tips. Or they can be pale. They can be very simple. They can be branched. They can be drastically branched. They can be tufted, like in the dog lichen. So that can help you identify them by looking at what kind of rhizomes it has. Sorry, I thought I heard somebody. Okay. This is a cross section through a foliose lichen. I had to borrow this one from a website because I never got a good one myself. But you can see the upper cortex and the lower cortex, the medulla, and the algal layer. You can see all four of them in the image there. These are some scanning electron micrographs I was able to get. This shows part of the cortex has been torn away. So you can see the cortex here, it's tough, it looks like leather. But there's the medulla underneath it, which is a loose hyphae, looks like spaghetti. And in this cross section, you can see the cortex, you can see the individual hyphae. But notice they're not separate, they're all glued together. So in the cortex, they excrete a chemical that glues the hyphae to each other. And so that gives a very strong skin to protect the lichen from the environment outside. Now, take a foliose lichen like this, take off the lower cortex, and then roll it up. And you've got a fruticose lichen, which have an outer cortex, just one cortex, a layer of algae underneath, and a medulla. And the branches of this lichen can be flattened, as in the common antler, or they can be round, as in your man's beard lichen. But in any case, they're really three-dimensional. They're really cool lichens. Now, to truly appreciate lichens and identify them and study them, you really need one thing, a good hand lens, because a lot of the structures on the lichen are hard to see with the naked eye. So a good hand lens. Dissecting scopes, compound microscopes, chemical laboratory, they're helpful, but all you really need is a good hand lens. Now, what can you see on a lichen that can help you identify? There's a rhizomes on the bottom, but on the upper cortex, there are a lot of structures associated with reproduction. Reproduction can be asexual, or it can be sexual. The asexual reproduction is basically some form of fragmentation. A lot of lichens are very brittle when they're dry. They break into pieces. The pieces can wash away or blow away or be carried away by animals. And if they land someplace favorable, they grow a new lichen. But many lichens have specialized structures. The Icidia are basically algae with hyphae wrapped around them. And that's a picture of one under the microscope. You see the algae, you can see the hyphae wrapping around it. They can be erupting from the surface like this. They can erupt from the edges like that. They look like, under a hand lens or a microscope, they look like a powder. And they can blow away, wash away, be carried away, and grow into a new lichen. Because they have the algae, they have the fungus. They're ready to go. A somewhat different way of doing this is called Icidia. The Icidia are outgrowths from the cortex. So they have a cortex around them, but inside there's medulla and algae. So here you have the fungus, you have the algae, they're ready to grow a new lichen. The only difference is this has a cortex on it. But these outgrowths, you can see they look pretty fragile. They are. They break off real easy. They can spread out and make new lichens. Now, conveniently for identifying them, lichens that make Icidia or Icidia usually only make one of them. Very few lichens make both. So if you can figure out what you've got, you can eliminate a whole bunch of other lichens, and that can help you identify by figuring out which one is present on this lichen. Now, lichens can also reproduce sexually. That means that cells from two different lichens, same species, get together and make spores. And these spores can fly out in the world, land someplace. And then we're not really sure what happens, but we assume the spore germinates and has to find an alga, grabs onto the alga and starts growing into a lichen. If it doesn't find an alga that's a good species for that lichen, it will die. Now, lichens are mostly ascomyces. That means they grow their spores in a little sac. So they're called sac fungi. And ascomyces have two kinds of spore structures. The macroscopic ones do anyway. there are Apothecia, which look like the cup fungi. In fact, that's what a cup fungus is the Apothecium of a non-lichen fungus. And these Apothecia means open containers, so they look like bowls. And the spores are released from the surface of the bowl into the air. The other group are the Perithecia lichens. Perithecia means container around. And they basically look like a bottle with a little hole in the middle that the spores can be shot out of. This limestone jigsaw, each of the bigger pieces of the puzzle has a black spot in the middle. That spot is the top of the Perithecia. And in the middle of it is a microscopic hole that the spores can be shot out of. Most sexual lichens are apothecial. So you're not going to find too many perithecial, but the apothecia come in a wide variety of forms. Most of them look like bowls, usually with a rim of the same color as the thallus, and some other color of the inner part where the spores form. Black and chestnut brown are very, very common. Other apothecia look like buttons. They have no rim. Others are flattened, like the ones at the tips of the field dog lichen. And others are just shapeless structures, like the red apothecia on the British soldiers. So they come in a wide variety of forms. Now, it helps you identify lichens. Lichens that produce Icidia or Icidia sometimes, but rarely produce apothecia. So it's kind of like if you're doing okay without sex, why bother? So if they can do it asexually, they don't bother to make apothecia or perithecia. Sometimes you can find them though. There are lots and lots of powdered ruffle and wildwood, and I've only seen one that had apothecia. They all have Icidia growing on them, but only one have I found with apothecia. So if you find apothecia, you can eliminate a whole lot of other lichens, and that helps to identify them. If you have a compound microscope and you like to use it, that opens a new field for you because you could look at spores. And for Crustos lichens, they're really hard to identify, and you really need to look at spores for those guys. This is a cross-section of an Apothecia made by my mycology students. And you can see the ascus of this lichen with 8 spores in it, 8 being typical for fungi. The other 2 are spores of lichens. I made the slides. I took the Apothecium off, sliced it up with a razor blade, put it in a drop of water on a microscope slide, put a cover slip on it, and then squished it. And I caused the spores to pop out. And then you can see the spores clearly under the microscope. Some of them have cool shapes. Some of them are actually multicellular. They have 8 cells in that species. Now, again, if you like doing this, that's a whole new world for you to explore, but you don't have to in order to study lichens. Okay. But one thing you'll find if you get into lichens, the books will start talking about chemistry. Because a lot of lichens can be identified only by the chemicals they contain. But don't panic. I know people are frightened by, well, I don't know about people in general, but some people are frightened by chemistry. Don't worry about it. The simplest chemistry is color. Because color is produced by pigments. So if you have colored chemical in the lichen, you'll have a colored lichen. The two most common colors that you're going to see are what we call mineral gray, which looks more like metal to me, but call it mineral gray, and a special color of yellow-green called arsenic green, because it's caused by arsenic acid, which is one of the most common lichen chemicals out there. Now, the old books call that yellow, which confused the heck out of me until I figured out what was going on. Modern books call it yellow-green or arsenic green. Once you've seen it, you'll recognize it anywhere. And that's the most common color. Other lichens are really yellow. They're called yolk or lemon yellow. Others are orange, brown, black, and off-white. So if you get the color, you know a lot about the chemistry. And then you can easier to identify it. One thing to look for is, does the color change when it gets wet? All lichens will look a little bit more green when they're wet because the algae migrate upwards. But some species turn dramatically greener. The long lichen, this one was in Maine, but I've seen it by Mountain Lake. If you see one out there and you throw water from the water bottle at it, it will reward you by turning brilliant green. And the shadow lichens, a whole genus of them, they're mostly dark gray. They're more camouflaged, they're hard to find. When they get wet, they turn brilliant green. So I've gone out in the forest after a rainstorm. Wow, look at all these green lichens. Well, those are the shadow lichens that camouflage that I see on other times. Now, if you learn more about lichens and read the books, they'll start talking about spot tests, which are tests to learn more about the chemistry. What you do is you put a drop of a chemical on the lichen, and it will change color, depending on what chemicals are in the lichen. The three most common tests are called K, C, and P. K is just potassium hydroxide, which if you're interested, you can get from Amazon. If you're not, the books say, I've never tried this, but the books say that drain and clogger, household lye will work as well. And you can get that from the hardware store. C is a solution of sodium hypochlorite, but even the professional lichenologists just use undiluted household bleach, which you can get from the supermarket. P-test is the one that's going to be hard for you to do because it's a solution of phenylene, diamine, and ethanol. And that stuff is toxic, possibly carcinogenic, and very hard to get. You can't buy it in a drugstore. You can't get it on Amazon. If you can find somebody who'll give you some, you can get it that way, but otherwise, you just won't be able to do that test. Fortunately, it's the least useful one because very few lichens do anything with P. Those that do, that's great, but if you can't do the test, don't worry about it. Ironically, although you can't buy paraphenylene diamine, you can buy hair dyes that contain it so you can rub it into your scalp. It won't work for lichens though because it contains, obviously the hair dye contains dyes, so it's not going to give you a good spot test. Now, how you do a spot test, you take a small piece of lichen, you should do it under a dissecting scope or a hand lens, and you put a drop of the chemical on it and see if it changes color. You can use the finest dropper you can find. You can buy, the capillary pipettes they use to draw blood when they do a finger stick. You can buy them from Amazon, and they work perfectly. They're cheap. Or some of the books say, get a toothpick, sharpen it with a pocket knife, and just dip that in and use that to put a drop on. Whatever way you do it, you put a tiny drop on either the cortex, in this case, or you scrape away some of the cortex and put it on the medulla. And it will change color. This is C plus red. The medulla has changed to red. That's K plus yellow. This one is really cool. It's K plus blood red. Although some books call it purple. But that's a cool one because orange lichens turn blood red. But sometimes the orange lichens can grow in a shady place. They look yellow. So you say, oh, that's not an orange lichen, that's a yellow lichen. Put a drop on it and it's a orange lichen, you know. If it doesn't do anything, it's called K minus or C minus. Nothing happens. And this way you can identify a lot of lichens from each other by the chemistry. Now, in time left, I'm going to tell you about some very common lichens that are fairly easy to identify. So you can go out in the woods and be reasonably sure you have the right species without having to worry about microscopes or chemistry or any of those things. The common green shield, Flavoparmelia caperata, is common all up and down the eastern United States, across the bottom and to the southwest, as far as California. It's all over the place. It's pollution resistant, so it grows in not big cities, but small cities like Radford or towns like Blacksburg. There's some growing outside on the parking lot, on the trees out there. So this is one of the most common lichens and probably one of the first ones you can identify. It grows on bark, although rarely can it occur on rock. It's that famous arsenic green. And on the surface, in the older parts of the thallus, it has Icidia. So if you look at it when a hand lands and you can find Icidia, you know you've got the common green shield. This one looks like it. The color's a little off in the upper picture, but it's arsenic green too. It's foliose. It grows on rock only. It's called Flavoparmelia baltimorensis, the rock green shield. It's not very pollution stable, so you have to go up in the mountains to see this one, like Grayson County. But you can tell it's not Flavoparmelia caperata because it has Icidia instead of Icidia. So there are two sister species, one with Icidia, one has Icidia, and you can tell them apart that way. This is another one that grows on bark, and it's fairly common even in places like Radford, Wildwood. So it's relatively pollution resistant. It's called a rough speckled shield, Punctilia rudecta. Some books say you can identify it while driving down the highway at 30 miles an hour, which is pretty good for a lichen. But you can do that because the outer edge is shiny. The middle is dull. And the middle is dull, and it's also rough because it's covered with thousands and thousands of Icidia. And in high magnification, you can see they are finger-like projections. And at really high, you see they all have a black dot at the end. That makes it rough and dull looking in the middle. The speckled part of the name is from these shiny edges, which have little white specks on them. Find white specks and Icidia in the middle, you have Punctilia rudecta. Those white spots are places where the color of the cortex is absent. The algae move away because there's too much sunlight, and so you see the medulla. This one is a cool one when you find it. It's foliose, but it has very narrow lobes. and they grow over each other. So it looks like a nest of snakes. They don't move. The whole thing is only about that big at the large. It's just a small lichen. And it's bright orange. It grows on bark, but it really likes bare wood too. And so you can find it on the fences in wildwood. It's Xanthum Mendoza Weberi, or Weber's sunburst. No Apothecia, but if you, with a good hand lens, you look at the tips of the lobes, underneath they have Icidia. So if you see a powder at the tips underneath, you know it's Xanthum Mendoza Weberi, Weber's sunburst. Excuse me. This one, you're going to find it fairly soon too. It's very common. It's very striking. It's kind of a bluish gray, pressed on the bark, and it's covered with little rimmed black Apothecia. It's Fishius dolores, the star rosette. It particularly likes to grow in crotches of branches. So although you can find it on bark anywhere, the crotch is a good place to find it. Now these two lichens are called Umbilicate. They don't have any rhizomes. All the ones I've just shown you have rhizomes if you pull them up and look underneath. But they're attached to the rock by what's called an umbilicus. So they're umbilicate lichens. You can see the umbilicus, maybe, because it's the same color as everything else, but it's the thing in the middle there is the umbilicus. That's the underside of this. On the upper side, you can see the little dimple where the umbilicus is, the navel, if you like, that attaches it to the rock. Both of them grow on rock. Usually you can find them together. They're like acid rock. I've seen them Mountain Lake. I've seen them in Grayson County. I've seen them in Buffalo Mountain. So rocks up in the mountains, you can find them all over the place. Umbilicaria mammulata, the smooth rock tripe, it's tan on top, smooth, no apothecia. The underside is sinued, meaning it has these ridges on it, black, felted. It often curls off when it's dry, rolls up, breaks off, blows away, breaks into pieces, and the fragments can start new lichens. So it can spread that way. With it, you can find Lathalia papulosa, the blistered toad skin. And you can see this one has an umbilicus too, right there, where it attaches by that one point. They're not really blisters though, because if you flip it over, every one of those bulges, there's a depression underneath. So they're really more like they're embossed, pushed up from below. And in between the blisters, there are little black dots. Those are apothecia. So it has tiny black apothecia. The Umbilicaria mammulata rock tripe, a lot of books say if you're starving in the wilderness, eat that. I say only if you're starving. I've tasted it. I'm told it's really good, sauteed with garlic and butter. But if you're starving in the wilderness, you won't have garlic and butter. This is you might think that this is fruticose, but it's still foliose. It's just more ruffled, more three-dimensional. It's the powdered ruffle in the genus Pomatrema. You can tell a Pomatrema is gray to greenish gray and ruffled, and it has cilia. You can see the cilia over here all around the edges, and here's an electron microscope. Cilia look like rhizomes, but they're on top. They grow from the upper cortex, not the lower cortex. What they do, I have no idea. And I've never seen any book even speculating what they do, except they help you identify lichens. They help you identify pomotula. So if you see a ruffle with cilia, you've got a pomotula. Most common species around here is Hypotropum, which has you can see it a little bit over here. You can see it in the edges up there. The edges have Ceridia on them. So that's why it's called powdered, because of the powder from the Ceridia. Also, Hypotropum is dark brown underneath, but white all around the edges. So if you have that combination of Ceridia and white around the edge underneath, you have Hypotropum, which is the most common one you find around here. Even more dramatically three-dimensional is the crumpled rag, Plasmachia tucumanii. And this one, you have to kind of go up in the mountains to find this. It doesn't like pollution very much at all. It grows on conifers and birches. And it's on bark, it's ruffled, greenish brown, and sinewed, which means it has these ridges on it, and brown apothecia around the edges. It's a really striking lichen. When I was first learning about lichens, I collected so many of these because every time I found one, I thought, ooh, cool. And then I began to realize it was the same thing every time. Now, Crustos lichens are really tough. You can enjoy them, but identifying them is hard unless you get spores. But this one is pretty easy. It's Descriptor, the scribble lichen. It looks like elvish runes. The elves are leaving messages in the forest. It's a Crustos, so it's just a bluish gray stain on the bark. And these black things on the surface, those are Apothecia. They've been stretched. In some cases, they branch. They're really weird Apothecia. And because they're so weird, they've been given a special name of literally. There are actually a whole bunch of scribble lichens, but most of them are tropical or subtropical. This far north, away from the coast, and further north from here, this is the only species you're going to find. So if you see it up here, you're pretty sure it's Descriptor and not one of the southern ones. Okay. Now we'll talk about some fruity coast ones. The common antler lichen, Pseudavernia from Socians, which you can find up in the mountains, and I've seen it in Montgomery County too. Dry Run Road, I think it was. And this is tufted fruity coast, flattened branches, and they're Icidia on the older parts of the thallus. So if you see this big clumpy thing with Icidia all over it, you've got the common antler. Another very common genus of fruity coast is Ethnia, the old man's beard. Identifying this to the genus is very, very easy. Identifying the species is very hard. So it'll drive you crazy if you try. Some of them are tufted and shaggy like this, like a killer mountain beard. Some of them are a little wispy and longer, like Dumbledore's beard and Harry Potter. But you can always tell the genus because they have a unique structure. Like any other fruity coast, there's an outer cortex, outer layer, medulla, but in the middle, there's a hard fungal structure called the central cord or the axis. So if you think you have an Ethnia, what you do is grab one of the thicker hairs and by the end, and then grab it again further back, pull. the axis and the cortex will invariably break in different places. So one or the other piece will have sticking out at the end, will have the central cord. If you have that, you have Ethnia, no doubt. If you don't, you have something else. Again, there's no doubt. So very, very easy to get the genus. Getting to species is crazy. But I'll show you two that are kind of cool and that are pretty good chance you're right if you identify it. Very few Icenia have Apothecia. They reproduce asexually, but a few species do. The Apothecia look like this. They have growing all over them from the edges fibers, just like the Icenia itself. They're pretty weird looking. And Eastern United States, there are only two species. Most common one is the bushy beard, Icenia strigosa. And it has the medulla is red or red-orange. So if you see that, you have Icenia strigosa. The other species that's rarer is white inside. And so you can eliminate that. Most Icenias are Icenia green. In fact, this is where the word Icenia comes from, is from Icenia. But this one, the red beard, is red, which is cool. It's a really cool color. And I've always wanted to see that lichen in the wild, and I never have. That specimen was brought back to me by one of my students who was doing a lichen inventory of Wildwood Park. Wow, where'd you get that? And he was really talented at seeing cool lichens in the trees or wherever and bringing them back to me. So he got some really great lichens. What he was not good at was keeping track of where he was. So he thinks it came from Wildwood Park, but he has no idea if he really was in the park or not. That's why I put a question mark after it. And of course, I can't go back and look for more because I don't know where he was. And I'll finish with the largest genus of lichens, which is also fruticose, and that's Clodonia. And Clodonia usually grows on the ground or on bare wood, and it has a two-stage life cycle. It starts off growing as little, very tiny foliose lichens, whole bunch of them in one place. They're attached at the bottom and they stick up. Those are called squamules. And eventually from the squamules will grow up a three-dimensional structure that we call the Apothecium. And the Apothecium is the sexually reproductive part. It will produce the spores. Now you can divide Clodonia into several groups. One group I call the Flakes because they never make any Apothecia. They're always nothing but squamules. And lock-loving Clodonia is an example of that. And because they never grow up, they never make Apothecia. You can call them the Peter Pans too, if you like, because they never grow up. Some of them have Icidia like this. Some of them actually grow Apothecia right on the squamules, but they never grow Apothecium. The other extreme are the reindeer mosses, which squamules are very short-lived. They disappear, and Apothecium comes up and branches and branches and branches and branches and branches until you have this shrubbery. In fact, it's used to make shrubbery for model railroads. And there are two species that are pretty common around here. The reindeer moss, typical one, Clodonia arbuscula subspecies sporosa, likes bogs and other poor soils. grows on the ground. That one was photographed in Man's Bog. Subtenuous, the Dixie reindeer moss, which you can guess grows south of most reindeer mosses. This likes to go on wood. So you can find it in wildwood on the ground in that picture and also on the fence post. Okay. Other Apothecia are much simpler. They look like cups or goblets or trumpets. The Clodonia Clothea group are the fairy goblets, a bunch of related species that are very hard to tell apart. The Apothecia are tiny and red. And I hope you can see them, maybe the people in the front row, all around the edges of the goblet. This one is really cool. Again, Apothecia around the edges. But the goblets grow another goblet from the middle of, and then another goblet from the middle of that one. They just keep growing up, goblet after goblet. So it's called the ladder lichen. And then the final group of them, I call the soldiers, after the British soldiers, which is one of the very, very few lichens that has a real common name. That is a name given it to by common people and not by lichenologists trying to get people interested. So the British soldiers were named by the settlers in 1600s because they thought the hats of the British soldier, the big red hats, looked like the Apothecia on the top of the British soldier. But all those in the soldier group have simple Apothecia, unbranched, or occasionally branched a little bit like British soldiers, and Apothecia on the top. So the British soldiers, the turban lichen, which has a brown Apothecium that's very convoluted and big compared to the Apothecium, or the southern soldiers, which you can guess are south part of the United States, Didyma, which are rather pathetic looking, but they have a little, tiny little Apothecium, bright red, on the top as well. So those are the various kinds of Clodonia, biggest genus of lichen out there. So now if I've got you interested and excited about lichens, and you want to know where you can get more help, I recommend this as a field guide, The Common Lichens of Northeastern North America. It's actually written for Atlantic Canada, but the common lichens are common over most of the East Coast. So most of the lichens in here, you'll find around here. So it's very useful in the field. And it's small enough to be a field guide, very helpful. I recommend it. And you notice British soldiers on the front that you just learned about. If you get more interested and want to know a lot more about them, you get the macro lichens of New England. Again, that's written for New England, but it's got every single macro lichen, which is Fruticosa folios. Every one of them that's ever been seen in New England or on the border. So a lot of things down here are rare up there, but they'll be in here. So just ignore what it says about rare or not rare. And almost everything you see down here is in here. And most of what's in here you'll find down here. Not everything, but it's very helpful. It's just big enough that you probably don't want to take it in the field very often, but it's very helpful for identifying them. And if you really get into lichens, I love this book. Beautiful pictures, really helpful information. It's the Lichens of North America, and it covers about 1,500 species out of the 3,600 species known in North America. but it weighs about 800, it has about 800 pages and weighs 7.5 pounds. You don't bring that in the field. And it's also expensive. You have a copy of this PowerPoint, or your tech people do, they can share it with you, and I urge you, share it with anyone who thinks is interested in lichens. Don't feel any problem about that. Just make sure my name stays on it and share it with anybody. But also on this page are a bunch of online resources that I found very helpful. And you can check those out for more information. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me. Scribble that down, or it's fairly easy to remember, G. Cote, my name, at radford.edu. So I welcome any questions or comments you may have now or by email. Thank you.
Is Spanish moss actually moss? Or what is Spanish moss?
Spanish moss.
Spanish moss. Spanish moss is not a lichen, not a moss. It's a flowering plant in the Bromeliaceae, the pineapple family, that grows, well, south toward the lower coast, the Gulf Coast. But it's not a lichen, it's not a moss. Another question?
Are there any instances of invasiveness or damage to the trees?
Invasive.
The lichens cause tree damage. Generally, it's assumed that lichens cause neither damage nor help to tree. They just grow on it. But I think that on occasions, there may be enough lichens that they get heavy and break the branches. But other than that, there's no evidence of any damage.
Thank you.
Can you check to see if there's any questions on the Zoom?
Yeah.
Are lichens used in carbon dating, and how far back do they go? I mean, what's the research?
Thanks, Beth and Fred. Lichens used in carbon-14.
Yeah, dating. Carbon-14 dating.
I would assume that you could use them for that.
Yeah. I mean, how far back and how many years? How many years? How far?
How many years? How long do they go back? Well, they're known for fossils. I don't remember numbers. I'm terrible at numbers, but they go way back on fossils. Carbon-14, I think that would be harder if you've got to preserve lichen and somebody's buried with somebody or in a bird's nest or something that's preserved. You can probably carbon-14 date it and learn when that was created. I don't know anything more about carbon-14 or lichen, so. You can try. I've also wondered how they, the new lichens that grow, I can't break off pieces of lichen, we can relocate them. You can try. I don't know how well it would work. I've always wondered when they Icidia, Icidia lands someplace, how they connect, especially fragments. But you can try it. I would predict they would grow if they don't blow away or wash away.
If you can't see the question, it's asking about if you break off and you try to relocate a lichen, if that's possible. And so he's saying that you can try, but you probably can't.